All right, so we're in the second week of our series that's entitled The Gospel in the Torah. And as Josh talked about last week, the Torah is like this one, Torah, which means teaching, is this one epic storyline that starts in Genesis and goes all the way to Deuteronomy. It starts with creation, and it ends with the people of God entering into the land in Canaan, the land that God had promised them, the promised land. It's 5 books that are also referred to as the Pentateuch. So if you maybe hear someone talk about the Torah, that's those 5 books. Pentateuch, those same, penta, meaning 5. That's those same, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about the 5 books that start the Bible. And as we journey through these 5 amazing books, we see something. We see how every story, every narrative, every law, every promise in the Torah is ultimately pointing to something. It's ultimately pointing to someone. It's pointing to Jesus. We see that God's message of hope and salvation is not just something that came along as we get to the New Testament, that God's message of hope and salvation was there right from the beginning of the narrative. God's message of restoration and hope and deliverance was right there. And we see how all of God's promises in the Torah, and actually in all of the Old Testament, that all of them find their yes in Jesus. And last week, I thought Josh did an absolutely amazing job looking at Genesis, taking us through the book of Genesis and talking about the people that God used to be his instruments in this project of restoration and reconciliation, this project of creation, as Josh used that term. And this week, we're looking at the next book, second book in the Torah. It's the book of Exodus. And the first 19 chapters of Exodus tells the story of how God delivered the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, sets them free to head to the promised land. And then in Exodus 19 through 40, we see God give the Israelites the law, the tabernacle, the sacrificial system, so that they would be his people and he would be their God. All of this stuff was about a relationship with the living God. It was about a love relationship with God. And I think, it's 40 chapters. It's a lot of material, but I think that there's 3 major themes that kind of come out in the book of Exodus that I want to talk about today. The first theme is this: God's grace always precedes our obedience. God's grace always precedes our obedience. The book of Exodus picks up the story where the book of Genesis left off. Abraham's grandson Jacob is leading his large family down to Egypt. Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, his favorite son, has been placed as second in command, kind of the prime minister of Egypt. And because Joseph saves his family and saves really the whole nation from famine, Pharaoh invites Joseph's family to come down to Egypt for safe haven, to find a place of safe haven. And eventually Jacob dies, Joseph dies, all of his brothers die, and about 400 years pass, during which time the Israelites are fruitful, successful, they multiply, they fill the land. And Pharaoh's attitude now towards this growing group of thriving immigrant people begins to change. He gets threatened by them. He begins to see them as a threat. So he responds in a number of ways, evil ways. He brutally enslaves them. He puts them into forced labor. And then Pharaoh, which is the king of Egypt at that time, he orders that all of the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Really, really evil stuff. And so Israel cries out to God for help. And God responds through a person named Moses. And when they're killing the Israelite boys, it's Moses' mother that takes this little baby and puts him in a basket on the Nile and sets him down the Nile, where he kind of floats safely down the river and is brought into Pharaoh's own family. So Moses, think about this. Moses, the person who God is going to use to defeat Pharaoh's evil, is actually raised in Pharaoh's family. I love how God does all of this stuff. I love the way that God weaves everything together, sometimes in ways that we can't figure out, like, what's going on? Why is God moving in this way? We see it in our own lives as well. It's like, why is God doing this? Why is God weaving this particular part into my story, into my narrative? And then as time goes by, we often see what God was doing in the midst of that. And God eventually commissions Moses to go to Pharaoh, to demand, so you've heard the phrase, let my people go, to demand that he let the people of Israel leave Egypt and be set free from this dehumanizing slavery that they're experiencing. But Pharaoh refuses, and he refuses over and over and over again. And that results in a series of plagues that comes on Egypt. And so a plague comes, and Pharaoh relents and he says, yeah, you can go. And then he changes his mind, and then another plague comes and Pharaoh says, yeah, you can go. He relents, and then he changes his mind, and then another plague. 10 plagues that go on. But Pharaoh still refuses to set the Israelites free. And then finally, God, through Moses, tells Pharaoh that his ongoing disobedience is going to result in catastrophic loss of life. That every firstborn son in every home in Egypt is going to die. But here's the deal, when God deals with disobedience, that God always has a response to the destructive consequences of disobedience. And we see that in this text, chapter 12, starting in verse 21. Then Moses summoned all of the elders of Israel, and he said to them, go at once, select the animals for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. And take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and some on the sides of the door frame. Not one of you shall go out the door of his house until morning. And when the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and on the sides of the door frame, and he will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer, huge piece in this, he will not permit the destroyer to enter your homes and strike you down. Now, first of all, and we've talked about this before, but this is super important, I think, to understand. Because I think we struggle sometimes with this when we read these stories. I want you to notice who the one is who is the causational agent of all of this death and destruction. It's not God. It's the destroyer. And that's an incredibly important thing to realize. It's the destroyer that takes life. It's the destroyer that causes life at times to unravel. God may allow it, as he did here, but God is not the causational agent. Now we think about our understanding of God and the fact that everything kind of operates under God's omnipotence and all of that there's the reason why sometimes we have in the Old Testament like causational language that's associated with God, but he's really not the causational agent. That the causational agent, and it's pointed out in this text, the causational agent is the destroyer, the enemy, the Satan, the devil. And I want you to notice something else. I want you to notice that according to this verse, the destroyer, the enemy, is not just coming for the Egyptians. He's not just coming for the villains in the story. It's not like there's the good people and there's the bad people, and the destroyer is coming for the bad people but not the good people. No, the destroyer is coming for everyone. He's coming for everyone, including the Israelites. The Israelites may be the group that's being oppressed here, but they are not without sin. And as you read through the Old Testament narrative, certainly in the Torah, but even in the rest of the Old Testament, you understand that profoundly. That the Israelites, even though they are the people of God, they are not without their own sin. They are not without struggles in living out God's obedience and saying yes to God. Like they have their own sin to deal with. And if they are going to avoid the life-taking impact of the destroyer, their need of God's intervening grace is just as much as the ones who are oppressing them. And this is a biblical truth that sometimes often gets overlooked, that the abuser and the abused are both in need of God's grace. That the oppressor and the oppressed are both in need of God's grace. That the powerful and the powerless are both in need of God's grace. Because the destroyer is hell-bent on destroying everyone. The destroyer is hell-bent on destroying everyone. His desire is to take down everyone. So how can the Israelites escape the destructive wrath of the destroyer? Well, they're instructed to sacrifice a lamb and put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of their home, on the top and on the sides. And when the destroyer sees the blood of the lamb, he will pass over that house, and no one in that house will die. And that's exactly what happens, is that the destroyer passes over the houses of those who put the blood of the lamb on their doorposts. And after all this takes place, Pharaoh finally, because he experiences loss through this as well, he finally allows the Israelites to leave. Now, as you read the story, you realize that God did not free the Israelites because of their obedience. Because sometimes, even when they were in Egyptian bondage, sometimes they were very disobedient. And God didn't free them because of their unwavering courage, because sometimes they had profound doubts. When you read the narrative in Exodus of like the things that the Israelites were saying when they were in Egyptian bondage, sometimes they had profound doubts about whether God could even save them, whether God even wanted to save them, whether he even desired to save them, whether he even knew what they were going to. Like they had all kinds of doubts that God doesn't save them because of their obedience. He doesn't save them because of their unwavering courage. God saves them through an act of grace. Their freedom was a pure act of grace. And the same is true for us. God does not say to us, pull yourselves together, get your act together, get your stuff together, and then I'll save you. God rescues us in the midst of our bondage. God rescues us in the midst of our brokenness. He rescues us in the midst of our fears, in the midst of our doubts. God's grace always precedes our obedience. That's the first theme that you see in the book of Exodus. Second theme that you see is this. You're not in Egypt anymore, and you shouldn't go back. Like that's a theme that comes through. You're not in Egypt anymore, and you shouldn't go back. When the Israelites leave Egypt, they travel many miles before they face the first obstacle in kind of getting to the promised land. It's the Red Sea. They get to the Red Sea, they're not quite sure what to do. And meanwhile, back in Egypt, Pharaoh and his officials have once again changed their minds about letting the Israelites go, and they've decided now to go after them. And so Pharaoh takes off in hot pursuit of the Israelites with 600, we're told, 600 chariots. Now, these chariots, like chariots may not sound real scary now, but these chariots, at that time, these chariots were the greatest military weapon of their time. Like the Egyptians were really the only ones that had these kind of chariots. They were terrible instruments of death. So Pharaoh was not just going out to passively recapture the Israelites, he was prepared to slaughter them if they put up any kind of resistance. His basic message was to them, serve me or die. Those are your two choices. You can either serve me or you can die. And I'm bringing 600 chariots to bear to make sure you know those are your only two choices. And when the Israelites see what's happening, they immediately begin to second guess their decision to leave. Look at what we're told in chapter 14. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. And they were terrified, which is understandable, and they cried out to the Lord, which is good. And they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out in the desert to die? Now, I have to say, as someone who uses sarcasm a lot, I kind of like the sarcasm of them. Like, is it because, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us out here to die? What have you done? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you, this is a lie, by the way, didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It's so much fun. Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. So the Israelites, here's the situation. The Israelites are trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. And in the midst of their incredible, dark situation, how do they respond? They respond by blaming Moses for their predicament, and they give all kinds of reasons of why they should go back to Egypt. They tell Moses that they were fine in Egypt. They never wanted to leave Egypt. It wasn't their idea to leave Egypt. That Moses was the one who talked them into leaving Egypt. Now, by the way, this is a lie. Like, they had prayed for generations to be set free from Egyptian bondage. In fact, in chapter 16, if you go ahead just a couple of chapters, in chapter 16, they just make up this narrative about how they weren't actually slaves in Egypt at all. About how when they were in Egypt, they just sat around, had fun, ate all the meat that they could eat, and about how they were actually living the good life in Egypt. Of course, all of it is a lie. They hated Egypt. They were brutally oppressed in Egypt. They told Moses over and over again how much they wanted to leave Egypt. In fact, we're told that they burst into almost uncontrollable worship. They burst into worship when they found out God's plan to deliver them from Egypt. Sometimes when it comes to things that enslave us, we function sometimes kind of like the Israelites. We say yes to God's freeing work in our life, whatever it is that God needs to set us free from. Maybe we're enslaved to a behavior, maybe you're enslaved to a habit, maybe you're enslaved to something else that has enslaved you. We say yes to that. We want to see God's freeing power, delivering power at work in our lives. And then when things don't go the way that we thought maybe that it would go when we said yes to God's freeing work, our first inclination is to try to go back to Egypt. And some of you may be feeling that right now. God is in the process of setting you free from something. He's setting you free from some destructive behavior. He's setting you free from some destructive relationship, or he's setting you free from some destructive attitude, or he's setting you free from your bondage to money, or maybe he's setting you free from something else, but he's setting you free from something. Whatever it is that you said yes to leaving Egypt, and now that you've said yes to leaving Egypt, now you're dealing with some unexpected challenges, and it's causing you to second guess your decision. You're wondering if you should maybe go back to Egypt. In fact, you may even be idealizing Egypt. That's sometimes what we do when God sets us free, and then we face really difficult stuff that we thought maybe wouldn't happen because God had set us free. Then we begin to idealize where we were. We say things, Egypt wasn't so bad. It may not have been awesome, but at least I knew what to expect. I knew what my life was like back then. Maybe I should just go back. Don't. Don't go back to Egypt. Don't let the darkness of the moment cause you to question the freedom God called you to in the light. Don't let the darkness of the moment cause you to question the freedom that God called you to in the light. One of the reasons the Israelites are so willing to go back to Egypt was because they thought they just had two choices. That's basically what Pharaoh said to them. You can either serve me or die. Those are your two choices. Serve me, go back to Egypt, serve me, continue to be enslaved to whatever it is, that I can enslave you to, or you die. And they bought into that. Like they bought into the fact that they only had two choices, either be slaves in Egypt or die in the desert. They don't even consider the possibility. This is what's so interesting about the story. They don't even consider the possibility that God could provide a way for their escape, which is so weird because God has just performed 10 miracles that has made it possible for them to leave Egypt in the first place, but now God is not even in the equation. They aren't even asking God to do anything. Think about it. They are standing on the banks of the Red Sea. God has miraculously brought them out of Egypt. But in a very real sense, even though he's brought them out of Egypt, in a very real sense, they are still slaves. They are slaves to the idea that God is too small, that God is too powerless to provide a way for their escape. And sometimes we do the same thing. We find ourselves in a difficult situation and we just take God out of the equation. We think that all we have are these two choices: die in the desert or become slaves again. Marry this guy or marry this girl or be alone forever. Hang on to all my money or become destitute. Medicate my brokenness or live in brokenness. Like whatever it is, these two choices, either going to be this or it's going to be this. And yeah, maybe this isn't awesome, but this is better than this because these are the only two choices that I have. But God, folks, God always provides another choice. He always provides another option. The God who parted the Red Sea can do it again. The God who rained down manna from heaven can do it again. The God who raised Jesus from the dead can do it again. But we have to make space for God to work in our lives. We have to say, I am not going back to Egypt. No matter what. No matter what I am facing, I am not going back to Egypt. That's the first thing. That's the second thing. The third thing is this: above all else, pursue God's presence. In the second half of Exodus, so this is all kind of in the first 19 chapters, but in the second half, chapters 20 basically to 40, we see another huge theme emerge, and it's all about experiencing the presence of God. And let me just give you a little context. Israel has been delivered from a life of slavery. God has brought them to Mount Sinai on their way to the promised land. And he's brought them to Mount Sinai to reveal his commandments for them. And the purpose of the commandments are not just to follow a list of rules and regulations or to somehow follow the commandments and earn God's favor. It's to help the Israelites live distinctive lives where they learn to love God and they learn to love others. That it's all driven by relationship with God. But as Moses is away at Mount Sinai, the people get impatient. And they take all of their gold jewelry and they melt it down into the shape of a golden calf. And they begin to worship this golden calf instead of the God who brought them out of Egypt. And when Moses comes down, he is furious, and God is furious. And there's this exchange, this very interesting exchange that takes place between Moses and God, where Moses is pleading with God to show mercy to this idolatrous group of people. And God does. God shows mercy, and he tells Moses that he will give the people the land that he promised them. He'll give them power. He'll give them military success. He'll give them resources. He'll give them all of that. But he will not give him his presence. He will not give them his presence because obviously they are not interested in his presence. And again, and I love Moses' persistence in prayer. Again, Moses pleads with God, and this is what he says. Then Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us, unless you are present with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing that you have asked because I am pleased with you and I know you by name." Now, the promised land offered just about everything that the Israelites could possibly want. It offered rest, it offered security, it offered freedom, it offered prosperity, it offered abundance, it offered everything. But Moses says, "God, if your presence is not going to go with us, don't send us there. Even though it offers all of this for us, don't send us there. All of the land, all of the wealth, all of the comfort, they mean nothing without your presence." Now, what Moses is saying is actually just the opposite of what many people in our culture say. Like he's saying, I don't want the land without your presence. I don't want the wealth without your presence. I don't want the provision without your presence. I don't want the power, the influence, the success without your presence. I don't want any of that without your presence. And what many people in our culture say is just the opposite. I want the land without the presence. I want the safety, I want the security, I want the freedom, I want the abundance, I want the power, I want the influence, I want the success in my life, but I'm not really interested in God's presence being a part of it. Now, as followers of Jesus, we would never say that. In fact, we probably would never think that. But what we might think, what we sometimes do assume, is that the land and the presence go together. In other words, if we pursue God's presence, we will always get the land. And the land could be almost anything. It could be finding a spouse or getting a job or making more money or experiencing great success in our careers or experiencing good health or getting healthy again or being healed, or it could be something else, whatever it is. Whatever it is, if we're pursuing God's presence and we don't get the land too, then we think something must be wrong. Like either I'm messing up or God's messing up, but somebody's messing up. If I've pursued the presence of God and I'm experiencing the presence of God and I'm not getting the land with it. But for Moses, it was all about experiencing God's presence. He didn't care about the land if he could not experience God's presence. Why? Because of what God says in verse 14, where he says, "My presence, Moses, will go with you, and I will give you rest." Moses understood that rest does not come from the land, that rest comes from the presence. Rest doesn't come from success. Rest doesn't come from reaching a certain level of income. Rest doesn't come from finding that perfect someone in your life. None of those things are bad. In fact, those things are really pretty good, but they will never bring us rest. Rest only comes when we experience the presence of God. The presence of God's Spirit at work in our lives, that when we experience God's presence, it is in experiencing God that we experience rest. As I mentioned before, we're going to close today with communion. And there's this direct connection. Sometimes we talk about it, maybe sometimes we don't. There's this direct connection between communion and the Passover meal that the Israelites celebrated on the night of their deliverance from Egyptian bondage. After Pharaoh permits the Israelites to leave, God tells Moses that the Israelites should establish a ritual of remembrance so that they would never forget this day. They would never forget this divine deliverance that they have experienced in Egypt. So every year, the Israelites would gather at the table and they would celebrate God's deliverance by partaking in a Passover meal. And for the Israelites, it was the Passover meal that reminded them of who they were. It was the Passover meal that reminded them of their identity. It reminded them that they were children of God. It reminded them that they were created in the image of God. It reminded them that they were people of deliverance. It reminded them they are people that had been delivered. But the Passover meal is not the last word on God's deliverance. In fact, the Passover meal actually points to something else. It points to another, more complete act of deliverance. And that's why on the night he was betrayed, Jesus began the evening by celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples. But then in the midst of the meal, Jesus transforms the Passover meal into something else, into a different kind of Passover meal. Now, throughout the centuries, Passover for the Israelites, for the Jews, for the Hebrews, for the people of God, the Passover meal has changed in some ways. I mean, it's thousands of years old, and so just the very fact that you have, thousands of years of tradition, there are different kinds of elements maybe on the table, things that are focused, the Passover meal, the Seder that is today that a Jewish person would partake in. And there's some differences between probably the Passover meal that Jesus would have set and the Passover meal that the Hebrews would have set back in the Old Testament. Like the Passover meal has changed in some respects, but there's always been three elements. Throughout history, throughout the thousands of years, there's always been three elements that were the part of every Passover meal. There was the unleavened bread that reminded the Israelites of the bread that was hastily baked as they put on, their garments and prepared to leave in the middle of the night, leave Egypt in the middle of the night. There were the 4 cups of wine that represented 4 different aspects of God's fellowship, the richness of God's fellowship. And there was the lamb that represented the lamb that was sacrificed and the blood of the lamb that was placed on the door frame, the top and the side of the door frame that is what allowed the destroyer to pass over the houses of the Israelites on that fateful night. 3 things: the unleavened bread, the wine, the cup, and the lamb. And at the table, Jesus takes 2 of those elements and he invests them with new meaning. He takes the bread, and instead of talking about, the bread that was eaten on the night that the Israelites left Egypt, he takes the bread and he shares it with the disciples. He says, "This is my body that is given for you, that is laid down for you." And he takes the cup, and rather than talking about the 4 different cups and the richness of God's fellowship and all of that, he takes the cup and he says, "This is the blood of the new covenant that is poured out for the forgiveness of your sins. So he talks about the bread, and he talks about the blood, but he makes absolutely no reference to the lamb. Why? Because the lamb is standing right in front of them. Because Jesus is the lamb. He is the lamb that is slain so that the destroyer will pass over and no longer be able to kill and destroy. That's why John the Baptist, when he sees Jesus, the only thing that he can say is, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. The Lamb of God who sets us free. For centuries, it was the Passover meal that reminded the people of God of their identity. But now Jesus was giving his people another ritual of remembrance. He was giving them a revised Passover meal. It's a Passover meal that reminds us of our identity in Christ. It's a Passover meal that reminds us that Jesus stepped into our Egypt, your Egypt, my Egypt. Jesus stepped into our Egypt and set us free. That Jesus stepped into our Egypt and delivered us from anything that would enslave our lives. Whatever it is that would enslave our lives, that Jesus stepped into our Egypt and he set us free from anything that would enslave our lives. That Jesus stepped into our Egypt. He stepped into our Egypt and he made it possible that the destroyer would not destroy us. That the destroyer would not destroy you. That the waters would not destroy us. That illness would not destroy us. That brokenness would not destroy us. That circumstances would not destroy us. That nothing, no battle, no fight, no battle can destroy us. That not even death itself, he stepped into our Egypt and made sure that not even death itself could destroy us. Can I get an amen for that? That's the God that we serve. That's the God that we celebrate. And I know that sometimes when we take communion that it's a moment of reflection and that's appropriate. But I think today I want us, when we take communion, I want it to be a moment of celebration because we are celebrating the God who has set us free. We are celebrating the God who has entered into our Egypt and set us free, delivered us. So let's celebrate that God together. Let's stand and worship him.